First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
As we reflect this month about the vow of our life, we confront the fact that we can say all kinds of noble and lofty things about our purpose here on earth. Yet we often find ourselves not being our best selves. The Christian tradition calls this sin, which I suggest we think of as being not so much about breaking God's rules as failing to live up to our own ideals of what we want to be, as breaking our vow. Can we be free? Free to live by our vow as we want to? So today, let's think about that. For starters, what is Lee so excited about? Why does he get hooked by one verse from Genesis 4, plunge into 2 years of intense exegesis about it, and conclude that thou mayest is humanity's ladder to the stars? The story of the conflict between Cain and Abel reflects the real conflict in the ancient Mideast between the tillers of the ground and the keepers of the sheep. It's also one of many times in the Hebrew scriptures that a parent or parental figure's real or apparent preference for one sibling over another causes trouble. For Lee, the key verse, Genesis 4:7, comes before Cain kills Abel. Cain is feeling sad because Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering, but not for Cain and his offering. Yahweh says, "Why so sad? If you do right, there is uplift, but if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master." You can be its master. The King James Version says, "Thou shalt rule over sin," which Lee reads as promising that humans will triumph over sin. The American Standard Version says, "Do thou rule over sin," which Lee reads as a command, an order to triumph over sin. The Hebrew word here is timshel. And of the 20-odd major translations into English, the only one that uses "thou mayest" is the JPS, Jewish Publication Society, translation of 1917 of the Tanakh. The Tanakh being the same 39 books as what the Christians call the Old Testament, arranged in a slightly different order. The 1917 JPS translation would be the one in use by English-speaking Jews of Steinbeck's time. If Steinbeck consulted with a rabbi, and apparently he did, the phrase they would have talked about was, "Thou mayest rule over sin." "You can be its master" is from the new JPS translation of 1985. It's a mix of "you're allowed" and a sort of "si se pueda," "yes we can" encouragement. John Steinbeck's East of Eden is a literary exposition on the Cain and Abel story, and in particular gives attention to this one verse. Steinbeck, through his character Lee, puts the emphasis on free will, "thou mayest." And for Lee, free will is a really super nifty thing. Free will is what he says makes a man great, gives him stature with the gods, for in his weakness and his filth and his murder of his brother, he still has the great choice. What is Lee talking about? When it comes to free will, I am reminded of the debates between free will and determinism, into which I used to egg my philosophy students. There were always a few students ready to defend the determinist position, and at least a few others ready to stand up for free will against determinism. Determinism is the claim that everything is caused and happens the way it happens because of its various causes. Here's what I have to say about that. Determinism is ultimately beside the point, but it does serve the purpose of helping to clarify what is the point. What is at stake when we strive for greater freedom? What will turn out to be at stake, I will argue, is relationship. Community, all of us welcoming each of us. Through love are we free. And through freedom, we can be what we really deeply want to be, can live by our vow. Determinism raises an important question. If freedom means you get to follow any impulse that happens to come upon you, whence do those impulses come? Your desires are produced by some combination of genetic predisposition and environmental influences. You get to choose, but you don't choose the factors that cause you to choose the way you do. Everything is the product of causes, with the possible exception of certain quantum phenomena, which some physicists say are entirely uncaused. Under certain conditions, the spin of certain particles is absolutely random. Nothing caused it to spin the way it is spinning and not the other way. So if quantum phenomena can be uncaused, can human behavior be uncaused? Well, what if it can? That's not what freedom looks like. If you saw somebody moving about randomly, muscles contracting here and there without cause or reason, we wouldn't say she was free. Quite the opposite. We'd say she was in the grip of, enslaved by, we might say, some bizarre and horrible neurological condition. Determinism makes a very logical point. Everything that happens is either the product of causal conditions and forces, or it isn't. If it is, then it's not free. And if it isn't, then it's random, and randomness isn't free either. Therefore, free will is an incoherent concept. This logical point is sound, but the sort of free will that is thereby defeated is not the sort of free will that anyone who yearns for freedom is yearning for. They aren't yearning for some incoherent concept, but for something very real in our experience. What is it? People who are yearning for freedom are yearning for liberation from some force or condition in their life. It might be a slave master or prison bars or an addiction or a mental illness or poverty or bad habits or impulsiveness. Someone yearning for freedom isn't looking to become uncaused. They just want certain causes removed so that happier causes can instead dictate their actions. They would like to be guided by purposes that make sense and are rewarding rather than by someone else's commands and threats of painful punishment. They would like to have certain specific constraints removed. They would like to be guided by the better angels of their nature rather than by their demons. Nor does determinism mean that we cannot hold people responsible for what they do. One of the causes at work producing human behavior is the social practice of holding a given person responsible for a given action. If that practice of holding each other responsible works, if it helps maintain an orderly society, then let's keep the practice. Moral disapproval sometimes works. There are a lot of things I don't do because the moral disapproval of those around me has taught me not to do that. The key relationships in our lives include a shared language of moral deliberation, and that's often a strong causal factor on our behavior. So, for instance, we don't shout inappropriately in public. But for people with Tourette's syndrome, that doesn't work. We say they aren't responsible for what they do, which is to say that the shared language of moral deliberation, praise, blame, censure, punishment, is an ineffective causal force for making them change that particular behavior. Much of the time, though, holding people responsible through the use of moral language works just fine. If your teenager has misbehaved and then protests that causes made him do it, you can just reply, "Of course, and now let's see if being grounded will cause better behavior in the future." So what I'm saying is this: thou mayest, you get to choose, doesn't mean that your choice is undetermined, not even a little bit. The mixture of influences you didn't choose, genetic inclinations you didn't choose, and maybe with some randomness thrown in that you also didn't choose, wholly determines what you will choose. But that's beside the point, because the important question isn't, are your actions determined? The important question is, what is freedom actually experienced as? We don't experience freedom as uncaused action, so when the determinist points out that there is no uncaused action, this fact is irrelevant to the experience we're talking about. The real question is how do we experience freedom, and how can we experience more of it? To that question, I will turn after our interlude. How about something free? How do we experience freedom, and how can we experience more of it? 1, we experience freedom when one of the causes is a shared language of moral deliberation. When an action happens reflexively or habitually or driven by obsessive-compulsive tendency or by any other mental disorder, we don't experience it as free as we do when the language of moral deliberation can play out in our minds and when there's a real possibility that we will actually carry out the conclusions of that deliberation. When we say that depression or schizophrenia and mania aren't free choices, we're saying that talking, blaming, scolding, threatening, ostracizing doesn't do much good. We experience freedom not when our action is uncaused, it's always caused, but when language, particularly the language of deliberation, is a key factor among the causes, then we experience it as free. 2, we also experience greater freedom when all our tastes and preferences, howsoever unchosen those tastes and preferences are allowed at the table. We don't, in the end, have to act to satisfy every taste, but not squelching or suppressing or denying that we do have the tastes we have is a piece of the experience of freedom. 3, we experience greater freedom when the causes that are coming from our own body, including our brain, are within the range of normal and healthy rather than including mental and physical illnesses. In John Steinbeck's East of Eden, the character Lee is excited about the Hebrew word timshel, translated as thou mayest. The possibility of acting where there is neither a command, do thou, nor a guarantee of outcome, thou shalt, is indeed exciting. It's very engaging. When no particular authority is commanding and the outcome is up for grabs, then we're called upon to use our moral deliberation. And then we bring all our tastes and preferences to the table. They all get to be considered, even if they aren't all gratified. And then we can pursue purposes with integrity, with an overarching sense of who we are. How can you get more timshel, more of that experience of freedom in your life? In other words, what might I say today that might function as a cause to help your action be less caused by causes you don't like and more caused by causes you do like? Practice attention. Just notice what's at work in you. Noticing that you're angry or that you're scared. Noticing the tightness in your chest or throat or shoulders or stomach. Noticing the heat rising on your skin, or the contraction of hair follicles, that is the hair standing on end feeling. Just bringing conscious awareness to these feelings gives them less power over you. Not zero, but less. Noticing hunger, just paying attention to the sensations, opens up a greater experience of freedom. If we don't much notice what the hunger really feels like, then we just reflexively grab a bite to eat. But if we do notice, possibilities of choosing otherwise come into view. We bring our own language of deliberation into the situation, and it might produce a different outcome than just unthinkingly responding. Or notice when you're not hungry. Am I reaching for some food when I'm actually not hungry? Noticing where that impulse or habit to eat might be coming from, if it isn't coming from hunger, allows us the feeling of greater choice, which is to say, it brings the language of deliberation into the mix. If sin is anything that isn't manifesting your best self, something that you did that came from an impulse that you would rather have overridden, the reminder that you have choice, that is, the reminder to bring conscious deliberation into the mix, can be helpful at keeping you on track of your vow. An example comes from a young woman who struggles with injuring herself, sometimes with impulses to suicide. She wrote a blog post that I happened to come across while I was scoping out thoughts on Steinbeck's East of Eden novel. She wrote, "A few weeks ago, my friend Austin told me about his favorite passage from John Steinbeck's East of Eden. In this part of the story, the characters discuss the different translations of the Bible story about Cain and Abel. They found that each translation used a different phrase to describe Cain's relationship with sin. The King James Version says, 'Thou shalt conquer sin,' whereas the American Standard one says, 'Do thou rule.' But the Hebrew word used is timshel, which translates to 'thou mayest.' And that means there is a choice. With timshel, Cain would have a choice to either rule over sin or not. As I sat on the floor listening to Austin speak, my knee shaking with the anxiety of the thoughts in my head, I felt the power of timshel. I knew that while my head was telling me to self-injure, that I needed to self-injure. In reality, the words in my head were not 'thou shalt,' but rather 'thou mayest.' I had a choice, and I was able to choose to be safe. Yes, I certainly want to affirm her power to choose to be safe. Of course, one passage from Steinbeck is not a cure-all. Her struggles returned. Still, any time we can manage to move into the space of conscious choice, bring the forces at work in us into the light of self-awareness, we do, if only temporarily, open up a little more freedom to follow our vow. At the same time, we should also remember that in Genesis, immediately after Yahweh tells Cain, "You can be its master," the very next two sentences are, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Come, let us go out into the field." And when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. So, one little reminder often doesn't do much. Cultivating the habit of constant self-awareness, always noticing the needs, feelings, desires as they arise. This is the practice of freedom. We do this not to suppress or reject the parts we don't like, but to own them and embrace them. To hold ourselves fully responsible, that is, response-able, able to respond to all of who we are. To own and reintegrate all of ourselves, all the terrible things we've done and said and felt or failed to say or do. This is the practice of freedom. Psychologists use the term dissociation to describe a range of detachments from reality. It often has to do with distancing ourselves from a part of ourselves. In extreme cases, it's multiple personality disorder, as the Dr. Jekyll self seeks to sequester and banish the Mr. Hyde self. We are all prone to some form of dissociation. We want to identify with the parts of the self that we like and get rid of the parts we don't like. Freedom comes from embracing it all. Cain is banished from the presence of Yahweh and goes into the land of Nod, east of Eden. Freedom comes from bringing your inner murderous Cain back from the land of Nod, the land of nodding off, the land of sleepy unawareness, back into the full presence of the awakened self, and owning the responsibility for all of who you are. Not indulging every whim, but not suppressing any whim either. Neither indulging nor suppressing, but aware of and responding to. We do not rule over sin, the impulses we will regret, by banishing it, but by welcoming it into the community of self, by recognizing the legitimacy of its needs. At the end of East of Eden, the servant Lee begs for the father Adam to give his son Cal his blessing. Don't leave him alone with his guilt. Let him be free, pleads Lee. And Adam, as he is dying, whispers one word, Timshel. He thus affirms that Cal has indeed, by accepting responsibility, demonstrated that he is capable of ruling over sin. In the end, freedom and responsibility are not something we can do by ourselves. We need each other, creating the community that can show all of us, all our parts, back into relationship. You have to do your part, but you don't have to go it alone. Indeed, you can't do it alone. Freedom means no one is banished, no part of you is banished. And that takes all of you welcoming all of who you are and all of us welcoming all of us. A British band called Mumford & Sons has a song titled Timshel. Some of the lyrics echo the East of Eden passage we've been looking at. And you have your choices, and these are what makes man great, his ladder to the stars. But the song lifts up also the crucial role of one another. But you are not alone in this. And you are not alone in this. As brothers, we will stand and will hold your hand, hold your hand. I can't move the mountain for you, but you are not alone in this. Timshel, we can do it. Si se pueda. Thou mayest rule over sin. That is, we just might overcome all banishment, heal from our dissociations, enter into a welcoming responsibility. We may become whole through love. We need all of us. That's our ladder to the stars. May it be so. Amen.